There were moments when the cruelty of the world crystallized into perfect clarity, when the illusions that protected vulnerable hearts from complete despair fell away to reveal truth that had always existed beneath comfortable lies about fairness and eventual justice. For Alira Moonwhisper, that moment of absolute revelation came on the morning of the mate ceremony, when she stood before her reflection in cracked mirror glass and acknowledged that she was about to walk into deliberate humiliation, disguised as sacred ritual. 22 years old and bearing scars that told stories of survival rather than celebration, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from learning to endure systematic cruelty without allowing it to destroy essential aspects of character that defined her worth independent of other people's recognition or acceptance. But strength earned through suffering was often mistaken for weakness by those who had never been tested beyond their comfortable assumptions about natural order and appropriate social hierarchies. The ceremony of bonds was supposed to be magical, a night when fated mates found each other through recognition that transcended conscious choice, when divine will expressed itself through attraction that created partnerships blessed by forces older than pack politics or personal preference. For most participants, it represented hope incarnate, possibility that their futures would be shaped by love rather than convenience, by spiritual connection rather than political calculation. For Alira, it represented the final confirmation of what everyone in the Silver Moon Pack had been telling her since childhood, that some wolves were meant to be chosen, while others existed merely to highlight the desirability of those fortunate enough to be born with advantages that attracted favorable attention and appropriate recognition. She had no family backing to recommend her to prospective mates, no notable bloodline that carried prestige or political connections that might compensate for personal characteristics that failed to meet conventional standards of Omega attractiveness. Her parents had died when she was barely old enough to remember their faces, leaving her to be raised by pack charity that made her continued existence conditional on gratitude and invisible behavior that avoided inconveniencing those generous enough to provide basic necessities. The scars that marked her arms and shoulders served as permanent reminders of the accident that had claimed her parents, while leaving her alive, but damaged in ways that pack healers could mend physically, but never quite erase completely. They were badges of survival rather than symbols of weakness, proof that she had faced circumstances that killed others and emerged intact despite trauma that would have broken lesser spirits. But to the pack that had shaped her understanding of her place in their social order, the scars represented imperfection that rendered her unsuitable for the kind of prestigious mating bonds that elevated families and created alliances that strengthened their community's political position within territorial networks that valued strength over compassion, beauty over character, convenience over complicated truths about worth that didn't conform to simple categories. Tonight, she would stand before assembled alphas who would assess her value according to criteria that prioritized bloodline, appearance, and social connections over qualities like loyalty, intelligence, or the kind of emotional resilience that had sustained her through years of casual dismissal and systematic exclusion from opportunities that might have revealed capabilities others preferred to ignore. Tonight, she would face public rejection that would be justified as natural selection, divine judgment that revealed her to be unworthy of the bonds that defined adult pack life and provided protection for those fortunate enough to possess characteristics that attracted favorable attention from those with power to grant or withhold acceptance. Tonight, she would learn whether the small voice in her heart that whispered about hidden worth and eventual recognition was wisdom or delusion, whether faith in eventual justice was courage or simple refusal to accept reality that had been demonstrated repeatedly through treatment, that revealed exactly how little her pack valued her continued presence among them. But sometimes, when hope seemed most foolish and faith appeared most misplaced, the world revealed truths that challenged every assumption about power and worth, about who deserved recognition and who had been overlooked, despite possessing value that transcended conventional understanding. Sometimes, when humiliation reached its peak and cruelty achieved its perfect expression, forces beyond pack politics intervened to demonstrate that divine judgment operated according to principles deeper than social convenience, that true strength recognized worthiness that others had been too blind or too limited to see. Tonight would determine whether Alira Moonwhisper was destined to fade into invisibility that preserved her from further harm, or whether her moment of greatest vulnerability would become the catalyst for transformation that would challenge everyone's comfortable assumptions about who deserved love, protection, and the kind of recognition that elevated the overlooked to positions that none of them had ever imagined possible. The mirror showed her truth without flattery or comfort, an Omega whose worth remained hidden beneath surface appearances that failed to meet conventional standards of attractiveness and desirability. But mirrors could only reflect what existed on the surface, could never reveal the depths that remained untested by circumstances that demanded more than simple endurance. Tonight, those depths would either sustain her through humiliation that might destroy her spirit permanently, or prove to contain strength that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to those wise enough to recognize what others had dismissed as unworthy of their attention or respect. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. Tonight, she would stand before assembled alphas, who would assess her value according to criteria that prioritized bloodline, appearance, and social connections, over qualities like loyalty, intelligence, or the kind of emotional resilience that had sustained her through years of casual dismissal and systematic exclusion from opportunities that might have revealed capabilities others preferred to ignore. Tonight, she would face public rejection that would be justified as natural selection, divine judgment that revealed her to be unworthy of the bonds that defined adult pack life and provided protection for those fortunate enough to possess characteristics that attracted favorable attention from those with power to grant or withhold acceptance. Tonight, she would learn whether the small voice in her heart that whispered about hidden worth and eventual recognition was wisdom or delusion, whether faith in eventual justice was courage or simple refusal to accept reality that had been demonstrated repeatedly through treatment that revealed exactly how little her pack valued her continued presence among them. But sometimes, when hope seemed most foolish and faith appeared most misplaced, the world revealed truths that challenged every assumption about power and worth, about who deserved recognition and who had been overlooked, despite possessing value that transcended conventional understanding. Sometimes, when humiliation reached its peak and cruelty achieved its perfect expression, forces beyond pack politics intervened to demonstrate that divine judgment operated according to principles deeper than social convenience, that true strength recognized worthiness that others had been too blind or too limited to see. Tonight would determine whether Elira Moonwhisper was destined to fade into invisibility that preserved her from further harm, or whether her moment of greatest vulnerability would become the catalyst for transformation that would challenge everyone's comfortable assumptions about who deserved love, protection, and the kind of recognition that elevated the overlooked to positions that none of the had ever imagined possible. The mirror showed her truth without flattery or comfort, an Omega whose worth remained hidden beneath surface appearances that failed to meet conventional standards of attractiveness and desirability. But mirrors could only reflect what existed on the surface, could never reveal the depths that remained untested by circumstances that demanded more than simple endurance. Tonight, those depths would either sustain her through humiliation that might destroy her spirit permanently, or prove to contain strength that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to those wise enough to recognize what others had dismissed as unworthy of their attention or respect. Chapter 1. The Grand Hall had been transformed for the ceremony of bonds into something that resembled a theater more than a sacred space, with elevated platforms that allowed optimal viewing of proceedings that would determine the romantic futures of every unmated wolf over 18. Flowers that bloomed only under moonlight decorated walls that had been polished to mirror brightness, while candles cast dancing shadows that made everything feel charged with possibility and anticipation. Elira entered wearing the formal white dress that tradition required of all Omega participants, simple linen that had been purchased secondhand from a pack member whose daughter had outgrown ceremonial garments that had served their purpose during previous seasons. The fabric was clean and properly fitted, but it lacked the embellishments and fine details that marked garments chosen specifically for occasions when appearance could determine life-altering outcomes. Around her, other Omegas moved with confidence that spoke of preparation that extended far beyond simply acquiring appropriate clothing. They had been groomed by families who understood the political importance of making favorable impressions, coached by mothers and aunts who possessed experience navigating social dynamics that could elevate or destroy prospects for advantageous mating bonds. Their dresses shimmered with beadwork that caught candlelight like captured stars, while jewelry that had been passed down through generations of successful matings announced their bloodlines and family connections with subtlety that educated observers would recognize and appreciate. Hair that had been arranged by professionals framed faces that glowed with health and contentment that came from lives unburdened by constant worry about basic survival necessities. "Look who decided to show up," whispered Celeste Nightshade, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Elira's ears, while remaining quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability about intentional cruelty. "I suppose even charity cases deserve their moment of public embarrassment." Several other Omegas giggled behind hands that had been manicured specifically for tonight's ceremony, their amusement creating ripples of attention that drew eyes toward the target of their mockery with precision that suggested practice rather than spontaneous meanness. Elira kept her expression neutral, despite the familiar sting of casual cruelty that had accompanied her through years of pack social events where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, endured rather than celebrated. She had learned long ago that reacting to such comments only provided additional entertainment for those whose amusement came at the expense of others' dignity and comfort. "I heard even the unmated elders were taking bets on whether any alpha would be desperate enough to claim her," continued Celeste with malicious pleasure, her words designed to carry maximum impact while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid direct confrontation that might result in consequences for inappropriate behavior during sacred ceremonies. "That's enough," said a quiet voice from behind them, cutting through the mockery with authority that surprised everyone present. Mira Goldenwolf, daughter of one of the pack's most prominent alpha families, approached with expression that combined social confidence with genuine disapproval for behavior that violated the spirit of ceremonies designed to honor divine will rather than provide opportunities for petty cruelty. "The ceremony is about to begin," she continued, her tone carrying the kind of natural leadership that came from being raised in environments where authority was expected rather than questioned. "Perhaps we could focus on its sacred purpose rather than entertaining ourselves at others' expense." Celeste's face flushed with embarrassment at being corrected by someone whose social position made retaliation inadvisable, though the resentment in her eyes suggested that this intervention would be remembered and possibly repaid through future opportunities for revenge that avoided direct confrontation with those capable of meaningful consequences. "Of course," Celeste replied with false sweetness, her tone carrying just enough edge to convey displeasure while maintaining surface compliance with proper ceremonial decorum. "We're all here for the same sacred purpose, after all." Mira turned toward Elira with expression that combined sympathy with something that might have been respect, recognition that enduring systematic mockery without losing dignity required strength that others took for granted or failed to recognize entirely. "Good luck tonight," she said quietly, her words carrying genuine warmth that felt precious in an environment where such kindness was rare enough to be noticed and treasured. "I hope you find everything you're looking for." Before Elira could formulate appropriate response that balanced gratitude with realistic assessment of her prospects for favorable outcomes, ceremonial horns announced the beginning of proceedings that would determine romantic futures according to traditions that claim to honor divine will while operating according to social dynamics that often rewarded conventional attractiveness over deeper forms of compatibility. The assembled Omegas arranged themselves along one side of the hall, according to protocols that had been established through generations of similar ceremonies, their positions reflecting family prominence and social connections, rather than alphabetical order or random assignment. Predictably, Elira found herself relegated to the far end of the line, positioned where she would be among the last to be considered for selection by alphas, whose choices would be influenced by options that remained available after more desirable candidates had been claimed. Across from them, unmated alphas formed their own line with confidence that spoke of understanding that tonight's ceremony would provide them with opportunities to advance their social positions through strategic partner selection, rather than challenging them to prove worthiness for bonds that might be withheld if they failed to meet appropriate standards. Alpha Marcus Silverclaw stood at the front of their formation, his position reflecting not just his family's political prominence, but his personal reputation as the most desirable mate available for tonight's ceremony. Tall and powerfully built, with features that would have been handsome even without the natural charisma that marked those born for leadership roles, he represented everything that pack mothers hoped their daughters would attract, through careful preparation and favorable presentation. Beside him stood other alphas, whose bloodlines and personal accomplishments had earned them positions of preference that would allow first choice among potential partners, whose selections would establish standards that influence subsequent pairings throughout the remainder of the ceremony. Elder Ravencrest stepped forward to begin the traditional invocation that called upon divine forces to guide the evening's proceedings, according to principles that transcended personal preference or social calculation, words that had been spoken at every ceremony of bonds since their pack's founding, and carried weight that made even casual observers feel the sacred nature of what they were witness. Sing, blessed moon that watches over all who seek their destined bonds, he intoned in voice that carried to every corner of the hall despite his advanced age. Guide our hearts and spirits toward recognition of connections that will strengthen our pack through partnerships blessed by your divine wisdom. Around the hall, pack members who had gathered to witness the ceremony bowed their heads in respect for traditions that governed one of the most important rituals in their social calendar, proceedings that would determine family alliances and territorial relationships for years to come through bonds that extended far beyond romantic attachment to encompass political and economic considerations. But for all the sacred language and ceremonial reverence, Elira could see the calculation in eyes that assessed potential pairings according to advantages they might provide, rather than spiritual connections that transcended material concerns. The ceremony honored tradition while serving practical purposes that had little to do with divine guidance and everything to do with social advancement through strategic partnership selection. Let the choosing begin, Elder Ravencrest announced, stepping aside to allow the ritual that would determine her future to proceed, according to patterns that had been established long before her birth and would continue long after her death, regardless of personal hopes or fears about outcomes that remained beyond her control or influence. Alpha Marcus moved forward with confidence that spoke of certainty about his selection, approaching the line of waiting Omegas with attention focused entirely on candidates whose family connections and personal attributes made them appropriate choices for someone of his social position and political ambitions. He paused briefly before several Omegas whose bloodlines connected them to prominent families, assessing options with the kind of careful consideration that characterized important business decisions, rather than romantic choices guided by emotion or spiritual recognition. When he finally extended his hand toward Celeste Nightshade, offering the formal invitation that would bind their futures together through bonds sanctified by ceremony and pack approval, the hall erupted in applause that celebrated not just their pairing, but the political alliance that their union would create between two of the territory's most influential families. Celeste accepted his offer with grace that had been practiced through years of preparation for exactly this moment, her smile radiating satisfaction that spoke of goals achieved through careful planning rather than surrender to forces beyond conscious control. One by one, other alphas made their selections according to calculations that prioritized social advancement over personal compatibility, creating partnerships that would strengthen their pack's political position while providing appropriate matches for individuals whose value had been recognized and appropriately rewarded through ceremonial bonds. As the evening progressed, and the line of available Omegas grew shorter, Elira found herself fighting growing anxiety about what would happen if the ceremony concluded without anyone extending selection offers to those who remained unclaimed, despite their participation in proceedings that were supposed to provide opportunities for every eligible pack member to find appropriate partnerships. The alphas who remained were either those whose own social positions limited their ability to attract the most desirable partners, or individuals whose personal standards exceeded their realistic prospects for acceptance by Omegas, who possessed characteristics that commanded premium consideration from potential mates. When Beta Gerald Stormwind approached her position with expression that suggested reluctant consideration rather than eager interest, Elira felt her stomach clench with anticipation of rejection that would be delivered with enough public humiliation to provide entertainment for observers who found amusement in others' disappointment and social failure. Elira Moon Whisper, he said loudly enough that his words carried clearly to pack members who had gathered to witness proceedings that had evolved from sacred ceremony into public spectacle. Stand forward for evaluation. Evaluation. The word carried implications that reduced her to commodity being assessed for purchase, rather than person being considered for partnership. Transformation of sacred recognition into commercial transaction that prioritized utility over compatibility or spiritual connection. She stepped forward with dignity that had been maintained through years of similar humiliations, keeping her chin raised despite circumstances that were designed to emphasize her inferiority to those who had been chosen earlier, based on advantages she could never possess, regardless of personal merit or character. "Turn around," Beta Gerald commanded, with tone that suggested he was performing unpleasant duty rather than considering potential mate whose company he might genuinely desire. "Let the assembly see what they're evaluating." The request transformed her into object for examination rather than person worthy of respect, display that emphasized her powerlessness in circumstances where others possessed authority to grant or withhold acceptance based on criteria that had nothing to do with her worth as individual or potential partner. But she complied with instructions that had been delivered as commands rather than requests, rotating slowly to allow observation that felt invasive despite the formal nature of ceremonial proceedings that supposedly honored divine will rather than serving entertainment purposes. "Scars?" observed Beta Gerald with tone that managed to sound both clinical and dismissive. "Visible imperfections that would mark any offspring with reminders of damaged bloodlines and inherited weaknesses." Around the hall, murmurs of agreement suggested that his assessment aligned with opinions that had been formed long before tonight's ceremony, provided opportunity for their public expression and validation through proceedings that claimed divine authority for judgments that reflected social prejudices. "No family backing," he continued with methodical precision that cataloged her deficiencies like inventory being assessed for potential salvage value. "No political connections that would provide advantages for partnerships designed to strengthen pack alliances and territorial relationships. No remarkable talents or abilities that would compensate for obvious disadvantages," added another voice from the assembly, pack member whose contribution suggested that her evaluation had become collective entertainment rather than personal consideration by individual alpha. The mockery that had begun as formal assessment devolved into systematic humiliation that exceeded anything she had experienced during previous pack gatherings, public degradation that used ceremonial authority to justify cruelty that would have been inappropriate under normal circumstances. "Perhaps," suggested Elder Blackwood with malicious amusement that violated every principle that ceremonies were supposed to embody, "we should allow the assembled alphas to voice their professional opinions about this Omega's suitability for mating bonds that would affect our pack's future prosperity and social standing." What followed was performance rather than evaluation, systematic verbal assault that used her vulnerability as entertainment for audience that found satisfaction in confirming their superiority through detailed catalog of someone else's perceived inadequacies and social disadvantages. "Weak scent," declared one alpha, whose own prospects were limited enough that he should have shown more sympathy for circumstances beyond individual control. "Barely detectable omega markers that suggest defective glandular development or genetic abnormalities." "Poor posture," added another with authority that transformed natural nervousness into evidence of character flaws that justified rejection. "Submissive behavior that indicates a lack of strength necessary for producing offspring, capable of contributing meaningfully to pack welfare." "Inappropriate bloodline," concluded Beta Gerald with finality, that suggested official verdict rather than personal opinion. "Ancestry that includes no notable achievements or beneficial genetic traits that would compensate for obvious current deficiencies." The systematic demolition of her worth as potential mate continued until even she began to doubt the small voice in her heart that had whispered about hidden value and eventual recognition. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was exactly as worthless as their assessment suggested. Presence that contributed nothing positive while consuming resources that could be better invested in supporting pack members whose value was clear and undeniable. Just as Beta Gerald opened his mouth to deliver formal rejection that would conclude her participation in ceremonies that had become exercise in public humiliation, the great doors of the hall swung open with force that sent sound echoing off walls like thunder announcing approaching storm. The Alpha King had arrived. The silence that descended upon the grand hall was absolute, the kind of hushed reverence that occurred when mortal wolves found themselves in the presence of power so vast it temporarily overwhelmed their ability to process normal sensory input. Every conversation stopped mid-syllable. Every laugh died before it could fully form. Every whisper of mockery evaporated in the face of authority that commanded acknowledgement without requiring any announcement of its presence. Alpha King Lysander Darkwood entered the ceremonial space with movements that spoke of predatory grace honed by centuries of existence that had elevated him far beyond the political limitations that governed ordinary pack leaders. Tall beyond what seemed physically possible for even the most genetically gifted wolves, with silver hair that caught candlelight like liquid metal, and eyes that burned with golden fire older than recorded history, He radiated presence that made the hall itself seem suddenly inadequate to contain forces that operated according to rules transcending normal understanding. Behind him followed members of the royal guard, whose very existence reminded everyone present that they were witnessing an unprecedented event. The Alpha King did not attend local pack ceremonies, did not involve himself in romantic politics that governed territorial communities, did not grant his physical presence to proceedings that were considered beneath royal notice under normal circumstances. Yet here he stood, scanning the assembled wolves with attention that felt both casual and intensely focused, as if he were searching for something specific among faces that suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable under scrutiny that could reshape their understanding of their own worth with single glance of approval or dismissal. "Continue," he commanded, when the silence stretched beyond what protocol could comfortably accommodate, his voice carrying across the space with authority that made even Elder Ravencrest appear small and uncertain, despite his position as master of ceremonies that had been proceeding according to established traditions, until royal intervention had transformed familiar proceedings into something unprecedented. But no one moved. The systematic humiliation that had been entertaining moments before now felt sordid and inappropriate in the presence of power that demanded higher standards of behavior from those who claimed to serve divine purposes through sacred ceremonies. Beta Gerald, who had been poised to deliver formal rejection of Alira's suitability for mating bonds, now stood frozen with uncertainty about whether continuing his assessment would be interpreted as appropriate ceremonial duty or offensive display of petty cruelty that violated standards expected in royal presence. "I said continue," the Alpha King repeated with tone that carried implications about consequences for those who failed to comply with royal commands delivered with patience that was already approaching its natural limits. "Your Majesty," Beta Gerald stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating under a tension that made his previous authority seem laughably insignificant, compared to power that could reshape reality through simple expression of royal displeasure. "We were just concluding the evaluation process for this Omega's suitability for ceremonial bonding." "Were you?" The Alpha King's attention shifted toward Alira with intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected, examined and valued, assessed and acknowledged in ways that had nothing to do with the systematic degradation she had been enduring moments before. "And what conclusions have you reached?" The question hung in air that seemed suddenly charged with dangerous energy, carrying implications that suggested wrong answers might result in consequences extending far beyond simple social embarrassment or temporary loss of royal favor. "The Omega appears to possess certain limitations," Beta Gerald replied carefully, his tone attempting to balance honesty with discretion while avoiding language that might be interpreted as inappropriate disrespect for someone who had suddenly become the focus of royal attention. "Limitations," the Alpha King repeated with inflection, that transformed the word into something that sounded far more dangerous than simple descriptive assessment. "Elaborate. Physical scarring from childhood trauma." Beta Gerald continued with growing nervousness that suggested he was beginning to understand that his evaluation was being evaluated in return, that royal judgment was being applied to judges who had assumed their assessments would remain beyond challenge or consequences. Lack of family connections or political advantages that would benefit strategic partnerships. "I see." The Alpha King stepped closer to where Alira stood with dignity that had somehow survived systematic assault on her worth as potential mate, his proximity radiating warmth that felt protective rather than threatening, despite power that could destroy anyone present without visible effort. "And these limitations, in your professional opinion, render her unsuitable for the bonds that this ceremony is designed to create." The trap that had been laid with royal patience was becoming apparent to everyone present, though Beta Gerald seemed unaware that his answers were determining his own fate, rather than simply assessing Alira's value as potential partner for strategic alliance formation. "In my judgment, yes, Your Majesty," he replied with misplaced confidence that suggested he believed royal presence validated rather than challenged his authority to determine worth, according to criteria that prioritized surface characteristics over deeper qualities that might require more sophisticated assessment to recognize. "Your judgment." The Alpha King's smile was neither warm nor entirely reassuring, carrying implications that made several pack members take unconscious steps backward from proceedings they had been eager to witness when they believed themselves to be observers rather than potential subjects of royal attention. "Tell me, Beta Gerald, What qualifications have prepared you to assess divine will regarding bonds that transcend your understanding of their true nature and purpose? The question revealed assumptions that had been built into the entire ceremony's structure, suggesting that local pack politics had been confused with spiritual recognition that operated according to principles beyond their ability to control or accurately evaluate. Your Majesty, I was following traditional protocols, Beta Gerald stammered, his face flushing with awareness that he was defending practices that royal presence had revealed to be inadequate or inappropriate for their stated purposes. Traditional protocols, the Alpha King mused, his golden eyes scanning the assembled pack with attention that made everyone present suddenly conscious of their own potential inadequacy for positions they had assumed to be secure. And these protocols include public humiliation of participants who fail to meet your personal standards for partner selection? Around the hall, pack members who had been enjoying Elira's systematic degradation now found themselves reconsidering their entertainment in light of royal disapproval that could extend to anyone who had participated in or approved of behavior that was being revealed as unacceptable. Your Majesty, Elder Ravencrest interjected with desperation that spoke of recognizing that their pack's reputation was being assessed along with their ceremonial procedures. We were simply following traditions that have governed our ceremonies for generations. Traditions, the Alpha King repeated with tone that suggested he found their justifications less convincing than they did themselves. And who, exactly, established these traditions that authorize cruelty disguised as sacred judgment? The question challenged foundations that had never been examined critically by those who benefited from systems that allowed them to exercise authority over others, without accountability for outcomes that prioritized their comfort over justice or divine will. The ceremonies are designed to ensure appropriate partnerships, Elder Blackwood offered weakly, his earlier malicious amusement replaced by growing anxiety about how their local customs were being perceived by authority that transcended their territorial limitations. Appropriate partnerships. The Alpha King's attention returned to Elira with intensity that seemed to assess not just her surface characteristics, but qualities that existed beneath appearances others had dismissed without proper examination. And you believe this Omega inappropriate for such partnerships based on what evidence? The challenge demanded justification for judgments that had been delivered as self-evident truth, but were now being revealed as opinions that might not align with more sophisticated understanding of worth and compatibility. She possesses no notable bloodline, Beta Gerald replied, though his confidence was crumbling under scrutiny that suggested his assessments were being found inadequate. No political connections that would strengthen pack alliances through strategic bonding. No notable bloodline. The Alpha King stepped even closer to Elira, his proximity making her acutely aware of scent that spoke of power and protection in equal measure. Tell me, what do you know of the Moon Whisper lineage? The question carried implications that challenged assumptions about her ancestry that had been dismissed as unremarkable by those who had never bothered to investigate heritage that might contain significance beyond immediate political utility. The Moon Whisper line died out generations ago, Elder Ravencrest replied with uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to suspect that his knowledge might be incomplete. There are no surviving members of that bloodline, are there not? The Alpha King's smile carried knowledge that exceeded their understanding while revealing assumptions that had been built on incomplete information. How thoroughly have you researched ancestry that you dismiss so casually? Around the hall, murmurs of confusion suggested that pack historians were beginning to reconsider records they had assumed to be complete and accurate. Genealogical documentation that might have overlooked connections that possessed significance beyond what local assessments had recognized. The Moon Whisper bloodline, the Alpha King continued with tone that carried authority of absolute knowledge rather than speculation or theory, includes connections to royal heritage that predate your pack's founding by several centuries. Ancestry that includes bonds to powers you lack the wisdom to recognize or properly honor. The revelation struck the assembled pack like physical blow, challenging every assumption they had made about her worth and social position while revealing their systematic dismissal to have been based on ignorance rather than accurate assessment of her true heritage. More importantly, he continued, extending his hand toward Elira with gesture that transformed her from object of ridicule into focus of royal recognition. She possesses qualities that your evaluation completely failed to identify or appreciate. Your Majesty, she whispered, hardly daring to believe that royal attention was being focused on her in ways that suggested value rather than dismissal. recognition rather than rejection, strength that endures systematic cruelty without breaking. He said clearly enough that his words carried to every corner of the hall. Dignity that survives assault without being diminished. Character that reveals itself through behavior under pressure rather than display during comfortable circumstances. His hand remained extended between them, like bridge spanning the distance between her current circumstances and possibilities that had never seemed available to someone in her position within pack hierarchies that operated according to rules she had assumed to be beyond challenge. "The question," he said, with tone that suggested momentous decisions were being offered rather than predetermined, "is whether you would accept recognition that has been denied by those too limited to see beyond surface appearances to underlying worth." Accept recognition. The phrase carried implications that challenged every assumption she had made about her own value and future prospects, suggesting possibilities that exceeded her ability to process in moments when transformation was being offered by authority that transcended every limitation that had defined her existence. "I don't understand, Your Majesty," she managed to say, her voice barely audible despite perfect acoustics that carried every word to audience that was witnessing proceedings they had never expected to observe. "I am claiming you," he said simply, his words falling into silence that felt charged with transformation, "as my mate, my queen, my equal partner in authority that will reshape understanding of worth and recognition throughout territories that have forgotten how to honor what they should treasure." The hall erupted in shocked gasps and whispered exclamations that revealed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The Alpha King claiming as his mate the Omega they had been systematically humiliating moments before, elevating her from lowest position in their social hierarchy to highest authority in their known world. "Your Majesty?" Elder Ravencrest stammered with desperation that spoke of recognizing catastrophic misjudgment that could result in consequences extending far beyond personal embarrassment. "Surely there are more suitable candidates for royal consideration among our pack's eligible Omegas." "Are there?" The Alpha King's attention shifted toward other Omegas, who had been considered appropriate choices for advantageous partnerships, assessment that made them suddenly conscious of their own adequacy for honors they had never imagined might be available. "Tell me which among them has demonstrated character sufficient for positions that will require strength beyond conventional understanding." The challenge revealed that royal standards operated according to criteria that had nothing to do with bloodlines or political connections. Assessment that prioritized qualities their local ceremonies had failed to recognize or properly evaluate. "Elira Moonwhisper," he said, his golden eyes returning to her face with warmth that felt like sunrise after endless night. "Will you accept bonds that will transform not just your personal circumstances, but understanding of worth throughout territories that have too long confused surface characteristics with underlying value?" The choice being offered was so far beyond anything she had ever imagined that accepting felt like stepping off cliff into sky, whose depths remained unmeasurable. Transformation that would challenge everything she understood about her place in world that had spent years teaching her to accept limitations as permanent rather than circumstances awaiting appropriate catalyst for change. But his hand remained extended between them, patient and warm, and offering possibilities that exceeded every dream she had ever dared to nurture during years when hope had been the only comfort available to sustain her through systematic dismissal and casual cruelty. "Yes," she whispered, placing her hand in his with movements that felt like claiming destiny rather than accepting charity, recognition rather than rescue. "Yes, Your Majesty." When their skin touched, the hall filled with light that had nothing to do with candles or moon, and everything to do with recognition that transcended conscious understanding. Bonds that had been waiting centuries for appropriate moment to reveal connections that challenged every assumption about chance and choice in matters that governed hearts and futures. The Omega they had mocked as worthless was about to become their queen, and their casual cruelty was about to be revealed as ignorance that had cost them far more than they could afford to lose. The light that erupted from the moment their hands touched was unlike anything the assembled pack had ever witnessed. Not the gentle glow that sometimes marked the recognition of compatible bonds, but something that seemed to pour from the very fabric of reality, illuminating the grand hall with radiance that made the ceremonial candles appear as insignificant as distant stars compared to the blaze. Ing Sun. Ancient symbols appeared in the air around them, burning scripts that wrote themselves in languages older than recorded history, marking the recognition of a bond that transcended ordinary mating ceremonies to touch on forces that governed the spiritual architecture of their entire world. The very walls of the hall seemed to vibrate with resonance that reached into foundations and emerged through surfaces that had never been designed to channel such profound energies. When the light finally subsided to levels that allowed normal vision to function, Elira found herself standing transformed. Not physically, for her appearance remained fundamentally unchanged, but something essential about her presence had been altered by recognition that elevated her beyond every limitation that had previously defined her place in their social order. The scars that had been catalogued as evidence of damaged bloodlines now seemed to glow with faint silver light that spoke of survival rather than weakness, trials overcome rather than defects to be hidden. Her simple white dress, moments before adequate but unremarkable, now appeared to shimmer with authority that had nothing to do with fabric quality and everything to do with the power that flowed through someone who had been claimed by the Alpha King himself. But the most dramatic transformation was visible in the faces of pack members who had been gathered to witness routine ceremony and found themselves observing the emergence of their future queen. Expressions that had carried mockery and dismissal now reflected shock, terror, and growing comprehension of exactly how catastrophically they had misjudged circumstances that had been far more significant than anyone had understood. "Behold your queen," the Alpha King announced, his voice carrying across the hall with authority that made every wolf present instinctively lower their eyes in submission. Recognition that power structures had been fundamentally altered by bonds that superseded every assumption they had made about appropriate hierarchies and natural order. Beta Gerald, who had been delivering systematic assessment of her inadequacies moments before, now knelt with face drained of all color, understanding finally dawning about the magnitude of his error in presuming to judge someone who had been under divine protection that operated according to principles beyond his comprehension or authority. "Your Majesty," he stammered, his voice shaking with terror that spoke of recognizing that his evaluation had been evaluated in return and found catastrophically wanting. "I had no idea, no understanding of her true heritage and significance." "Ignorance," the Alpha King replied with tone that suggested such explanations were insufficient for behavior that had violated principles governing treatment of those under royal protection, "is not an adequate defense for cruelty that reveals more about your character than about the worth of those you presume to judge." Around the hall, other pack members who had participated in or enjoyed her systematic humiliation were beginning to understand that their entertainment had been observed by authority that found their behavior not amusing, but revealing of deficiencies that would require correction through means they probably wouldn't find comfortable. Elder Ravencrest approached with movements that spoke of desperate attempts to salvage pack reputation, from circumstances that threatened to expose their ceremonial procedures as inadequate or inappropriate for their stated sacred purposes. "Your Majesty," he began with careful formality that attempted to balance acknowledgement of royal authority with preservation of local autonomy, "we are honored by your presence and recognition of one of our pack members. However, perhaps there are diplomatic considerations that should be addressed regarding the integration of our territories under royal authority." Diplomatic considerations. The Alpha King's attention shifted toward the elder with intensity that made the older wolf take an involuntary step backward. "Are you suggesting that royal recognition of my mate requires negotiation with those who failed to recognize her worth despite years of opportunity to demonstrate appropriate honor and respect?" The question carried implications that challenged the fundamental assumption that local pack authority could negotiate terms with royal power that transcended territorial limitations and operated according to principles beyond their ability to influence or modify. "The ceremony," Elder Ravencrest continued with growing desperation, "traditionally concludes with celebrations that honor all new bonds created through divine recognition. Perhaps we could arrange appropriate festivities to mark this unprecedented occasion." "Festivities," the Alpha King mused, his golden eyes scanning faces that had been eager to participate in mockery, but now appeared significantly less enthusiastic about celebrating outcomes their cruelty had helped to precipitate. "Tell me, what form would such celebrations take? Public acknowledgement of worth that you systematically denied? Recognition of value that you dismissed without proper consideration?" The systematic exposure of their behavior was becoming more than simple embarrassment, evolving into comprehensive demonstration of how thoroughly their pack's social dynamics violated principles that should have governed communities claiming to serve divine will through sacred ceremonies. "Your Majesty," Mira Goldenwolf interrupted with courage that exceeded wisdom, stepping forward despite obvious danger to address authority that could reshape her existence through casual displeasure. Not everyone participated in the inappropriate behavior that preceded your arrival. Some of us recognized that the treatment being displayed violated the sacred nature of these proceedings. The Alpha King's attention shifted toward her with interest that felt less dangerous than his previous assessments, though still carrying weight that made her struggle to maintain steady breathing under scrutiny that could determine outcomes ranging from royal favor to permanent exile. "Indeed?" he asked, with tone that suggested genuine curiosity about whether their pack contained members whose character exceeded the standards demonstrated by their leadership and ceremonial participants. "And how did you demonstrate this recognition during proceedings that preceded my arrival?" "I attempted to intervene when mockery became inappropriate," she replied honestly, though her voice carried awareness that such efforts had been minimal compared to the systematic assault that had been allowed to continue until royal intervention had finally brought appropriate correction. "Attempted," he repeated with inflection that suggested such efforts might have been appreciated, but were hardly adequate for circumstances that demanded more substantial intervention from those who claimed to understand appropriate behavior during sacred ceremonies. The weight of his judgment was beginning to settle upon everyone present like physical pressure that made breathing difficult while revealing character inadequacies that extended far beyond simple ignorance about protocol or appropriate ceremonial behavior. "The question," the Alpha King continued with tone that suggested important decisions were being formulated that would affect far more than just individual consequences, "is whether this pack possesses sufficient wisdom to serve as home territory for my queen, or whether alternative arrangements might better serve her dignity and our shared authority." Alternative arrangements. The phrase carried implications that made every pack member present, suddenly conscious of their territorial status, and continued autonomy being subject to royal approval that might be withdrawn if their behavior failed to meet standards that had been revealed as far more stringent than they had previously understood. "Your Majesty," Elder Ravencrest said with desperation that approached panic, "surely the misunderstandings of this evening can be addressed through appropriate apologies and assurances that such inappropriate behavior will never be repeated under our ceremonial protocols." Misunderstandings. The Alpha King's smile carried implications that suggested he found their attempts at minimization less convincing than they appeared to find them themselves. "Is that what you would call systematic humiliation of someone under divine protection? Simple misunderstanding about appropriate treatment of those whose worth transcends your ability to recognize or properly assess?" The systematic demolition of their justifications was revealing assumptions that had never been examined critically, exposing behaviors that had been normalized through repetition, but violated principles that should have governed communities claiming to serve higher purposes than personal entertainment or social advancement. "The Silver Moon Pack," he announced with finality, that suggested decisions had been reached that would prove irrevocable once formally pronounced, "will undergo comprehensive reformation under direct royal oversight, beginning immediately and continuing until your ceremonial procedures and social dynamics align with standards appropriate for territories that serve as home to royal authority." Direct royal oversight. The phrase carried implications that effectively ended their autonomy, while subjecting every aspect of their community life to scrutiny and correction, according to standards they had never been required to meet under previous territorial arrangements. "Furthermore," he continued with tone that brooked no argument or appeal, "those who participated in tonight's inappropriate behavior will face individual assessment to determine whether their character can be reformed, or whether alternative arrangements would better serve community welfare and divine justice." Individual assessment by royal authority whose standards had been revealed as far more demanding than local pack politics had prepared them to meet. Evaluation that would determine their futures according to criteria that prioritized character over social position or family connections. "But first," he said, turning toward Elira with expression that transformed from judicial authority to something approaching tenderness, "my queen requires appropriate preparation for her new role and responsibilities." Queen. The title still felt foreign applied to someone who had entered the evening expecting rejection and dismissal, transformation so complete that she struggled to process implications of elevation that exceeded every dream she had ever dared to nurture during years of systematic marginalization. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent hall with clarity that suggested others were straining to hear words that might provide insight into how someone in her position was processing circumstances that had elevated her beyond their ability to challenge or influence. Lysander, he corrected gently, his hand finding hers with touch that radiated warmth and protection in equal measure. In private moments, you may call me Lysander, though in public settings, appropriate formality serves important purposes that extend beyond personal preference. The instruction carried implications about protocols that would govern her new position, while acknowledging that their relationship transcended purely political considerations to include personal intimacy that operated according to different rules than public authority. The coronation will take place within the month, he announced to the assembled pack, whose faces reflected growing comprehension of how thoroughly their social order was about to be transformed by presence of royal authority that would reshape every assumption they had made about power and its proper exercise. Until then, he continued with tone that suggested interim arrangements were being established that would prove temporary, but necessary for appropriate transition to circumstances that none of them had anticipated. Queen Elira will reside under royal protection, while receiving instruction in protocols and responsibilities that will prepare her for duties that extend far beyond local pack polity. Seize. As royal guards moved to escort them from ceremonies that had been transformed beyond recognition, Elira caught sight of faces that had mocked her hours before, now watching her departure with expressions ranging from terror to desperate attempts at ingratiation that suggested growing awareness of how dramatically power relationships had shifted. But rather than satisfaction at their obvious distress, she found herself feeling something closer to pity for people who had revealed themselves to be limited by assumptions that prevented them from recognizing worth until royal authority made such recognition unavoidable. The Omega, who had entered the ceremony expecting humiliation, was leaving as queen whose emergence would challenge every comfortable assumption about strength and weakness, worth and dismissal, divine judgment and social convenience. Her transformation was complete, but the real changes were only beginning with pack that would learn the difference between ceremonies that served divine will and entertainment that violated sacred principles, between recognition that honored character and assessment that prioritized surface characteristics over underlying worth. The Alpha King had claimed her not as rescue, but as recognition, not as charity, but as acknowledgement of value that had always existed beneath circumstances that had prevented others from seeing what should have been obvious to those wise enough to look beyond conventional standards to spiritual truths that operated according to principles deeper than social hierarchy or political convenience. Behind them, the Grand Hall fell silent, except for whispered prayers and desperate planning by people who were beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about natural order and appropriate treatment of others had been challenged by authority that would accept nothing less than complete transformation of attitudes that had been revealed as inadequate for territories that claimed to serve divine purposes. The ceremony that was meant to humble her had instead elevated her beyond their ability to influence or control, proof that sometimes divine justice operated through methods that challenged everyone's understanding of how power should be distributed and recognized in communities that claimed to honor higher purposes than personal comfort or social advancement. 1 year later, the anniversary of the ceremony of bonds had been transformed from a celebration of mating traditions into a festival honoring recognition that transcended surface appearances, a day when the Silver Moon Pack gathered not to witness public assessments of worth, but to celebrate bonds that had been formed through genuine compatibility rather than political calculation. Queen Elira stood on the balcony of the royal residence that had been constructed where the old Grand Hall once stood, watching her former pack members interact with ease that spoke of communities that had learned to value character over bloodline, compassion over cruelty, recognition over dismissal. Below, in the festival grounds, Beta Gerald, now former Beta Gerald, having been stripped of rank and assigned to community service that required him to assist those he had once dismissed, helped elderly pack members find comfortable seating with dedication that suggested genuine transformation, rather than simple compliance with royal mandate. Elder Ravencrest, whose ceremonial duties now included oversight of reformed procedures that prioritized dignity over entertainment, moved through the celebrations with expressions that combined relief with ongoing awareness that their pack's reputation remained under scrutiny that would continue until transformation proved permanent rather than temporary adjustment. "Any regrets?" Lysander asked, joining her observation of festivities that celebrated not just their bond, but the systematic changes that had rippled throughout territories where royal authority had established new standards for community behavior and ceremonial conduct. "None," she replied honestly, leaning into warmth and strength that had become sanctuary rather than intimidation, comfort rather than overwhelming power that demanded constant deference. Though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did. You would have survived, he said with confidence that spoke of understanding her character through observation that extended beyond single dramatic intervention, and eventually found circumstances that recognized your worth. Divine justice operates according to principles that ensure such recognition, though perhaps not always through methods as immediately satisfying as royal intervention. Throughout the territories that comprised their expanding kingdom, similar festivals were taking place in communities that had adopted reforms emphasizing recognition of worth that existed independent of conventional markers of success, ceremonies that honored spiritual connection over political advantage, bonds that served divine will rather than social ambition. The transformation had been as profound as it had been necessary, challenging assumptions that had governed pack relationships for generations, while establishing new standards that prioritized character over convenience, compassion over calculation, recognition over the kind of systematic dismissal that had nearly destroyed someone whose value exceeded anything their limited understanding had been none equipped to appreciate. The queen who had once been mocked as worthless now governed territories where such mockery had been replaced by systems that honored contribution rather than bloodline, that valued strength expressed through endurance rather than dominance, that recognized divine worth in forms that challenged conventional expectations about leadership and its proper expression. Her scars had become symbols of survival rather than evidence of damage, reminders that strength often emerged from circumstances that tested character beyond breaking points, that revealed true worth to those wise enough to recognize it when divine justice finally provided appropriate recognition. The Alpha King had claimed her not as rescue, but as acknowledgement of value that had always existed, not as charity, but as recognition of worth that transcended every limitation their former circumstances had imposed through ignorance rather than accurate assessment. Together, they ruled territories where ceremonies honored rather than humiliated, where recognition elevated rather than dismissed, where divine judgment operated according to principles that served justice rather than entertainment, for those whose amusement came at the expense of others' dignity and worth. The Omega who had walked into humiliation had emerged as queen, whose transformation challenged every assumption about power and its proper recognition, proving that sometimes the most profound changes began with those who seemed least likely to matter, until divine justice revealed worth that had been waiting centuries for appropriate acknowledgement. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps, and if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.